My name is Renata Voss, and I was 34 years old the afternoon I pulled into my own driveway and saw a real estate sign staked in my front lawn. I had just driven back from burying my mother. The sign was white with red lettering, and it had my address printed on it in a clean, professional font. There was a little box of flyers attached to the post. I sat in the car for a long moment. The engine was still running. My mother-in-law, Diane Voss, had called it handling things. That was the phrase she used when I spoke to her from the funeral home parking lot in Asheville 3 days earlier. Renata, you are not in a position to manage a property alone right now. We're handling it. I didn't argue. I was standing in a parking lot in the same dress I'd worn to identify my mother's body, and I didn't have anything left to spend on an argument. What Diane didn't know, what none of them had thought to check, was that the house she'd already accepted an offer on had a recorded title history she had never seen. I knew what was on file at the county recorder's office. I had known for 11 years. What I didn't know yet was exactly how public the moment of correction was going to be. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I put out a new story every week. And if you've ever had someone make a major decision about your life while your back was turned, drop a comment below. You are not alone. I grew up in a town called Sutter Creek, in the California foothills, in a house that smelled like cedar and the particular brand of dish soap my mother used her entire adult life. My mother's name was Gloria Marchetti, and she was a practical woman in the way that women of her generation and circumstances had to be practical, not cold, not unfeeling, but clear. She understood the difference between sentiment and strategy, and she believed, with a quiet firmness that shaped everything about how I moved through the world, that a woman should always know exactly what she owns. She said it to me for the first time when I was 9 years old. We were sitting at the kitchen table going through a box of papers she kept in the hall closet, insurance documents, the deed to the house, a folder of receipts going back to the 1980s. She spread the deed out flat on the table and pointed to her name. "This is what it means to own something," she said. "Not who you're married to. Not whose name is on the mailbox. This, right here." I never forgot that. I moved to Sacramento at 22 for a job in hospital administration. I was good at the work, scheduling, compliance, the particular kind of organized persistence required to keep a large medical operation running without visible seams. I wasn't dramatic about my competence. I just showed up and did what needed doing and kept careful records of everything, which is a habit my mother gave me and which would matter more than I knew. I met my husband, Daniel Voss, at 26. He was a structural engineer, careful and measured, with a dry sense of humor I found immediately appealing. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, bought a house in Elk Grove on the southeastern edge of the Sacramento metro. The house was a 3-bedroom craftsman on a corner lot, built in 1948, with a deep front porch and a yard my mother said reminded her of the house she'd grown up in. We closed in the spring. My name went on the deed. Daniel's name went on the deed. That was how it worked, and that was how it should have worked, and neither of us thought twice about it. Daniel's family was a different kind of practical than mine. His mother, Diane, was a tall, organized woman from Stockton who had run her husband's contracting business for 30 years and had opinions about everything and a particular talent for delivering those opinions in tones that made disagreement feel socially dangerous. She wasn't cruel, exactly, not in the way that word usually gets used. She was managing. She managed people the way she managed inventory. She assessed what they had, what they lacked, what category they fit into, and she assigned them roles accordingly. She had assigned me the role of capable but fragile before I had been married to her son for a year. I don't think she meant it as a verdict. I think she genuinely believed it. I was quieter than she was, more internal, less likely to voice an opinion at a Sunday dinner. She interpreted that as uncertainty rather than discretion. She started calling to offer guidance about the house, about managing money, about whether I had thought carefully enough about various decisions. Daniel loved his mother, and I loved Daniel, and so I absorbed it without comment, which she interpreted as agreement, which she interpreted as confirmation that guidance had been needed. Daniel's father, Raymond, was a different matter entirely. He was a short, barrel-chested man who had spent 40 years swinging hammers and reading blueprints, and who had a habit of arriving at our house unannounced with a six-pack and a theory about why our gutters needed replacing. He was loud and opinionated in a way I found easy to read and therefore easy to manage. He meant no harm. He just took up space. Daniel had a younger brother named Colton who worked for Raymond's business, and who was married to a woman named Brianna, with whom I had no conflict and no particular closeness. We existed in parallel. Holidays, the occasional weekend gathering, a surface-level cordiality that never deepened into friendship. That was fine. Not every family becomes intimate. Some families just stay adjacent, and that has its own kind of peace. The anchor of the Voss family, the person who held the center, was Daniel's maternal grandmother, Edna Calloway. She was 81 when I met her, a retired bookkeeper from Modesto who had raised 3 children alone after her husband died young, and who had the particular authority of someone who has managed genuine hardship without complaint. She was small, white-haired, with a sharp, assessing gaze that I recognized immediately as a version of my own mother's. She saw things clearly. She didn't perform opinions, she stated them. Edna and I understood each other from the first Thanksgiving. She sat next to me at the table and asked me about my work with a directness I found immediately refreshing after a day of Diane's managing, and when I answered, she actually listened, and when the men started talking over us, she simply raised her voice by 1 increment and continued the conversation. And I noticed that nobody interrupted her. After dinner, she found me in the kitchen and said, without preamble, "Diane means well. She just has trouble with women who don't need rescuing." I told her I'd noticed. She smiled. "You'll be fine," she said. "You know what you own." I didn't understand then that she meant it literally. I understand now. Over the following years, Daniel and I built the kind of life that looks uncomplicated from the outside. 2 incomes, a house we were slowly renovating, a routine that suited us. We were not flashy. We did not take expensive vacations or drive impressive cars. I paid down the mortgage aggressively because my mother had taught me that a paid property is a foundation and a financed one is a liability, and I watched the balance drop with a quiet satisfaction I didn't talk about at family dinners. Diane periodically offered opinions about the house, that we should sell and move somewhere larger, that the neighborhood wasn't appreciating the way it should, that a house like ours was a starter property, not a forever home. I listened. I did not argue. I made coffee and changed the subject. The house was mine and Daniel's. The deed said so. That was the whole of it. My mother's health began to decline when I was 31. She had a progressive lung condition, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady and diminishing in the way that some illnesses are, grinding down stamina and capacity over months and years. She was still in Sutter Creek, still in the house with the cedar smell and the hall closet full of organized papers, and I drove up to see her as often as work allowed. In the 3rd year of her illness, she asked me to sit with her at the kitchen table again, the way we had when I was 9. She had a folder in front of her. Inside was the deed to her house, the title to her car, her will, and a document I hadn't seen before, a transfer on death instrument she had filed with the El Dorado County Recorder's Office. She walked me through every page with the same calm clarity she had always brought to paperwork. She told me what each document meant and where the originals were and what steps I would need to take when the time came. Then she tapped the transfer on death instrument and said, "This one is the important one. This is what makes sure nobody can claim there's a question." I asked her if there would be a question. She looked at me with a patience I recognized as love. "There's always a question," she said, "unless the paper is already filed." She died 14 months later, on a Thursday morning in late October, at home, in her own bed, with me and her sister present. The hospice nurse was there. It was quiet. It was the kind of death my mother would have approved of, organized, attended, without dramatics. I called Daniel from the hospice nurse's car before I drove to the funeral home. And then I called the El Dorado County Recorder's Office to confirm the transfer on death instrument was on file, because my mother had raised me to do things in order, and because grief does not suspend practicality, and because I knew, with a certainty I had no reason yet to act on, that things were about to get complicated. The complications began before my mother was in the ground. I was in Asheville, not Sutter Creek, Asheville, North Carolina, because my mother had a sister there, my Aunt Patricia, and because the funeral home my mother had prearranged was there, because she had moved to be closer to Patricia in her final year when her mobility declined and Sutter Creek became harder to manage alone. I had helped her with the move. I had updated the address on every document, confirmed that the transfer on death instrument remained valid across state lines for the California property, and organized her Asheville paperwork with the same systematic care she had always modeled for me. So I was 3 time zones away, in a funeral home parking lot in North Carolina when Diane called. I had texted the family when my mother passed. A brief message. Mom passed this morning. Funeral will be Saturday in Asheville. I'll be home Tuesday. Because I didn't have the capacity for more than that, and because they didn't need more than that. Diane called 4 hours later. I answered because I always answered, and because grief hadn't yet recalibrated my defaults. Renata, she said, in the tone she used when she had decided something, I want you to know that we're going to take care of things while you're away. I asked what things. There was a brief pause, the kind that contains a decision already made.
The house, she said.
Raymond and I have been talking, and with everything you're dealing with right now, it isn't practical for you to be managing a property alone. We've spoken to someone, a realtor we've used before, and she thinks the market timing is very good right now. I was standing in a parking lot in a black dress with my mother's death certificate in my purse, and I said, Diane, the house is not for sale. Renata. She said my name the way she always said it when she was about to explain something to me that she felt I wasn't seeing clearly. Daniel agrees this is the right move. The mortgage is a significant expense on one income, and there are much better options in the market right now. Colton and Brianna found something lovely in Roseville and the school district. I don't have children, I said. The point is, it is a buyer's market in that corridor and a seller's market where you are, and Raymond has looked at the numbers and…
Diane.
I kept my voice level. My mother died this morning. I will be home on Tuesday. Please do not contact a realtor. She said, I understand you're grieving, sweetheart. That's why we want to handle this for you. I said goodnight and hung up. I should note, because it matters for understanding what came next, Daniel and I had been having a difficult year. Not a catastrophic year. Not the kind of year that announces itself as the end of something. The kind of year that accumulates in small, quiet increments. Too much distance, too many decisions made separately rather than together, a growing awareness that we were managing our shared life more than we were living it. We had not discussed separation. We had not discussed anything really, which was part of the problem. When Daniel called me that night, I told him what his mother had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She's just trying to help.
She's worried about you.
She's trying to list her house, I said. Our situation has changed, he said. I think she has a point about the mortgage. I asked him what our situation was. He didn't answer directly. He said we'd talk when I got home. He said it wasn't the right time. He said he loved me, and he hoped the service went well, and he'd pick me up from the airport on Tuesday. Something in my chest went very cold and very still. I got through the funeral. I stood at the graveside in the Asheville light and said goodbye to my mother and accepted condolences from her sister and her sister's friends and the few people from Sutter Creek who had made the drive, and I held myself together with a particular kind of composure that is not really composure, but is its functional equivalent, the thing that looks like composure from the outside while everything inside is doing what it needs to do. Daniel did not come to the funeral. He said it was a busy week at the firm. I did not argue. I drove to the airport myself. When I landed in Sacramento and turned my phone off airplane mode, I had 6 text messages from Diane, 2 from Colton, and a voicemail from a real estate agent named Sandra Pelham at Premier Properties, thanking me for the opportunity to list my property and confirming that she had posted the listing that morning and already had a showing scheduled for the following afternoon. I sat in my seat while the other passengers retrieved their bags from the overhead compartments. I read the messages twice. Diane's messages were, in order, an update that Sandra had walked the property and agreed the price point was excellent, a note that Sandra had taken care of the interior photos while I was away and the listing was live, an encouragement that I would feel better once I had seen the offer, a reassurance that Raymond had reviewed the contract, and it was standard. A suggestion that I might want to think about whether a short-term rental in Roseville made sense while I decided on next steps. And, finally, a message that said simply, "There's been an offer. It's a good one. Call me when you land." Colton's messages asked me to call their mom. I did not call their mom. I called a cab. I took the cab from the airport to my house. I asked the driver to wait. I got out and looked at the sign in my yard, the white and red Premier Properties sign with my address in clean professional lettering and the little flyer box attached. I looked at it for a long time. Then I went inside, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and called my mother's attorney. My mother's attorney was a woman named Helen Kurtz, based in Sacramento, who had handled my mother's affairs for 20 years and who I had spoken with twice in the months before my mother's death to confirm that all documents were in order. Helen was in her 60s, unhurried, with a voice that conveyed a precise and unsentimental confidence. I told her what had happened. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause, a professional one, the kind that means I am being careful about what I say next. "Renata," she said, "a listing is not a sale. An offer is not a sale. The sale becomes legally binding at closing when ownership is verified and title transfers. And title verification will require a title search." I knew what a title search was. "I know," I said. "Then you know what they're going to find," she said. I told her I wanted to be in the room when they found it. She told me that was entirely my right as the owner of record. I asked her what I needed to do. She told me, "Nothing. Not yet. Let it proceed to the closing table. Let the closing agent run the title. And then be there." I hung up and sat with my coffee and looked at the kitchen where my mother-in-law had walked through my home with a camera while I was burying my mother, and something settled in me. Not anger exactly, but its more useful cousin. The clear, flat certainty of someone who has always known what was on the deed. The closing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, I went to work every day, and I spoke to Daniel in the evenings, and I listened while he explained, carefully and with the evident conviction of someone who had been persuaded by people he trusted, that selling the house made practical and financial sense given our situation. I asked him, more than once, to define our situation. He said he thought we needed a change. He said his parents had offered to help us both get back on our feet. He said the offer on the house was $487,000, which was above asking, and that his parents thought we should take it. He did not say, "I am leaving you." He said, "I think this is the right practical step." I nodded. I did not tell him what I knew. I had learned from my mother that the paper is the thing, and the paper was already filed, and telling Daniel what was on it before the closing table would only give Diane time to find a workaround, and I had not spent 11 years watching Diane navigate around obstacles to underestimate her when she had notice. So I said, "All right, I'll come to the closing." Daniel looked surprised. Diane had apparently told him she expected resistance. "You're okay with it?" he asked. "I want to be in the room," I said. He said that was fair. He said he was glad I was being reasonable. He said his mother would be relieved. I made coffee and said nothing further. I should tell you about the offer and about who was in the room at the closing because both of those things matter. The offer was from a couple, I'll call them the Hayeses, who were relocating from the Bay Area, young professionals with a toddler, exactly the buyer type Sandra Pelham had projected when she'd assessed the listing. They were represented by their own agent. The transaction had a title company, Pacific Western Title, a standard Sacramento area firm, and the closing was scheduled at Pacific Western's office on Watt Avenue on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November. Diane had arranged for the full Voss family to be present. Her logic, as she explained it to me the evening before, was that this was a family transition, and families should be present for transitions. Raymond was coming. Colton and Brianna were coming. Sandra Pelham would be there. The Hayeses and their agent would be there. I said I would be there too. Diane said that was wonderful, and that she was glad I was handling this so well, and that she knew it was hard, but it was the right thing for everyone. I said goodnight, and went to bed and slept a surprisingly solid 8 hours, which I attribute to the specific calm of someone who knows exactly what is going to happen. The Pacific Western Title Office was on the second floor of a low commercial building on Wood Avenue, with a parking lot that held maybe 20 cars and a lobby that smelled like carpet cleaner and filtered air. I arrived 7 minutes before the scheduled start time. The Hayeses were already there, seated in the waiting area with their agent, a polished woman in her 40s who stood when I walked in and introduced herself as Carol Tran from Sunrise Realty. I introduced myself. She said, "Oh, you're the seller?" I said yes. There was a brief pause in which she processed something. Then she smiled and said it was nice to meet me. The Voss family arrived together as a unit, which I had anticipated. Diane first, professional, composed, in a dark blazer, followed by Raymond, who was in what appeared to be his second nicest clothes and who shook my hand with a solemnity that suggested he understood the moment to be significant. Colton and Brianna came in behind them, and Sandra Pelham arrived simultaneously from the parking lot, and in the space of about 4 minutes the conference room had filled with 8 people plus the closing agent. The closing agent's name was Marcy Aldrin. She was perhaps 45, compact and efficient, with the particular air of someone who has run enough real estate closings to have seen most of what human nature produces in them. She had a thick folder on the table in front of her and a laptop to her left and a yellow legal pad to her right. She welcomed everyone. She explained the procedure. She said they would start with the title verification and deed review, then move to the seller documents, then the buyer documents, then disbursement. Diane settled into the chair beside Daniel with a small satisfied smile of someone who has organized an event successfully. Raymond clasped his hands on the table. Sandra Pelham uncapped a pen. Marcy Aldrin opened her folder. And then she stopped. It was not a dramatic stop. It was the stop of someone reading carefully, finding something unexpected, and taking a moment to confirm what they're reading before speaking. She looked at the top sheet. She looked at the second sheet. She looked back at the top sheet. She picked up her pen and made a small notation on her legal pad. The room was quiet. The Hayes couple exchanged a glance. Carol Tran tilted her head slightly. Marcy Aldrin set down her pen, folded her hands on the folder, and looked up at the room. "Before we proceed to the seller documents," she said, "I need to confirm the ownership of record on this property." She looked at Sandra Pelham. "Was a title search run prior to listing?" Sandra Pelham's pen stopped moving. "Standard preliminary," she said. Everything showed clear. "I'm looking at the deed of record," Marcy said, "and I'm showing 2 names. Can someone confirm the full legal name of the sellers?" Diane said, "Voss, Daniel, and—" "The deed shows 2 owners," Marcy said. She was not interrupting exactly. She was clarifying. Both owners would need to be present and consenting to sign. "Is the second owner present?" There was a pause. Diane looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. I looked at Marcy Aldrin. "Yes," I said. Marcy looked at me. "Are you Renata Marchetti Voss?" "I am." She nodded once. She made another notation. She said, "I'll need to review this in detail before we proceed." Raymond's hands, folded on the table, went very still. Diane's chin came up by a fraction, not much, but I had watched Diane's chin for years, and I knew what that fraction meant. It meant recalibration. It meant the landscape had just shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated, and she was reassessing. The Hayes couple looked at their agent. Carol Tran had her hand flat on her notepad and was very carefully not looking at anyone in particular. Sandra Pelham was looking at Diane. The room had the particular stillness of a space in which multiple people are simultaneously understanding that something is different than they believed. Marcy Aldrin worked efficiently. She spent perhaps 4 minutes reviewing her documents, the deed of record, the title search output, a printout that I recognized as the county assessor's current ownership listing. She made several notations. She pulled up something on her laptop and compared it to the paper in front of her. Then she set everything down and looked up. "I want to make sure everyone in the room has the same understanding before we go further," she said. Her voice was even, neutral, the voice of someone whose job is to state facts, not render verdicts. The property at this address was purchased in March of 2013 by Daniel Voss and Renata Marchetti Voss as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Both names appear on the recorded deed. Both owners are required to sign any transfer of title.
She paused.
Was there a divorce or legal separation that would have addressed property division? Daniel said, No. Is there a power of attorney authorizing anyone other than Ms. Marchetti-Voss to act on her behalf in this transaction? Diane said, She's present. She's here. Yes, Marcy said. She is. She looked at me again. Ms. Marchetti-Voss, were you aware that this property was listed for sale? The Hayes couple had gone very still. The toddler they'd brought, who had been sitting quietly in his father's lap, made a small noise, and Mr. Hayes shifted him without looking away from the table. I said, I was informed of the listing after it was live. While I was out of state for my mother's funeral. The sound in the room changed. It is difficult to describe exactly what that change was. It was not a gasp, it was not an exclamation. It was the sound of 8 people recalibrating simultaneously, a collective adjustment that had a quality almost like air pressure shifting. Carol Tran's hand moved to her notepad. Raymond's jaw tightened. His eyes went to the middle distance. Colton looked at his shoes. Brianna looked at the wall. Sandra Pelham looked at Diane with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very communicative. Diane did not look away from Marcy Aldrin. Her face had gone the particular white-around-the-mouth color that I associated with her moments of genuine surprise, not embarrassment, not yet, but the blankness of someone whose operational model has just been invalidated. I see, said Marcy Aldrin, and wrote something on her legal pad with deliberate calm. She then looked at the buyer's agent. Miss Tran, I'll need to pause the closing. The transaction as structured cannot proceed without a valid dual signature from both owners of record, and based on what I'm hearing, the listing was placed without the consent of one owner. That is something both parties' counsel will need to address before we can reschedule. Carol Tran said, Understood. She said it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been a real estate agent long enough to know what this meant for her client's timeline and who is already doing the math on relocation logistics. Mr. Hayes said carefully, So, the house is not. We're not closing today. Not today, Marcy confirmed. Is the listing valid at all? Carol Tran asked. That, said Marcy, is something the attorneys will sort out. I'm not in a position to speak to that. She began gathering her papers with the brisk finality of someone whose job at this meeting was complete. What I can tell you is that any transfer of this property requires both owners' consent and signature. That's what the deed of record shows. She looked at the room one more time, neutrally, as if taking attendance. I'm going to step out and make a couple of calls, she said. Ms. Marchetti-Voss, I'll need about 5 minutes with you before you leave, just to confirm a few things for my records. Of course, I said. She gathered her folder and her legal pad and walked out of the conference room, and the door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. The room was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The toddler in Mr. Hayes's lap said, Dada. Mr. Hayes said, Yeah, buddy. And that was the only sound for a moment. Then Diane looked at me. Her face had moved through the white blankness phase and into something more complicated, something that I recognized with a kind of weary clarity as the early stage of reconstruction. Diane was very good at reconstruction. She was very good at finding the frame that made her the reasonable party in any given situation.
Renata, she said.
You could have simply told us. She said it in the reasonable tone, not the theatrical tone. The real one. The quiet, slightly injured register of someone who genuinely believes that a problem arose from a failure of communication rather than from a unilateral decision to list someone else's house without their knowledge. I looked at her. I thought about my mother at the kitchen table, spreading the deed flat, pointing to her name. I thought about the parking lot in Asheville, the dress, the death certificate. I thought about Daniel saying I think she has a point about the mortgage, and I'm glad you're being reasonable. I had exactly 4 words I wanted to say. I said them once, quietly, and I did not repeat them. It wasn't yours to list. Then I picked up my purse and went to find Marcy Aldrin. I spent 11 minutes with Marcy Aldrin in a small side office down the hall. She confirmed the deed details, noted the absence of any power of attorney or legal separation agreement, and told me, in the calm and matter-of-fact way of someone who understood real estate law very precisely, that the listing agent had an exposure problem. She said it just like that. The listing agent has an exposure problem. She was not speaking as my advocate. She was speaking as someone doing her job, which required her to note the facts of the situation as she understood them. The facts, as she understood them, were: a property had been listed for sale by one co-owner without the knowledge or consent of the second co-owner. The listing had been live for 3 weeks. A showing had been held. An offer had been accepted. A closing had been scheduled. None of that transferred any title. The title had not moved. The title could not move without my signature, and I had not signed anything. The listing, as a legal matter, was without authority. What happened to Sandra Pelham professionally, I don't know in detail. What I know is that she was a realtor with a license and a broker who would need to be informed of the circumstances, and that the State Real Estate Licensing Board takes a specific and unsympathetic view of listings placed without ownership verification. I'm not going to tell you she lost her license because I don't know that for certain. I'm telling you that she called me twice in the week after the closing, and I referred both calls to my attorney, and I never heard from her again after that. The Hayeses, Carol Tran told me when she called the following morning to apologize, which she did genuinely and professionally, were fortunately flexible on timeline. They had not given notice on their current rental. Their relocation was employer-sponsored with some flexibility. She said they would be in touch when the situation clarified. I told her I appreciated the call. The situation was not going to clarify in the way she was probably imagining. Daniel and I separated 3 months after the closing. It was not a dramatic separation. There were no scenes, no ultimatums, no confrontations in the style of the thumbnail text on family drama videos. There was a long and quiet conversation on a Sunday afternoon in January, in the living room of the house that was still mine and Daniel's, in which we established the facts of our situation with the kind of mutual exhaustion that comes from a year of not talking about something directly. He said he was sorry. I believe he was sorry. He said his family had overstepped, and he hadn't handled it well, and he knew that. I told him the honest thing, which is that the house listing had only clarified something that had already been true, that we had stopped being a unit somewhere in the preceding year and had both been performing the maintenance of something that had already ended. That wasn't something Diane had done to us. That was something we had done or failed to do together. He said, "That's very fair of you." I said, "I'm not trying to be fair. I'm just being accurate." We agreed on terms. The house was half his, per the deed, and he was entitled to his share of its value. We got a real estate attorney, a different one neither of us had a prior relationship with, and we listed the property together, with both our signatures on every document, at a price we both agreed to. It sold in 6 weeks for $502,000. We split the equity after the mortgage payoff. I walked away with a number that let me think clearly about next steps. I found a 2-bedroom house in East Sacramento, closer to work, with a deep backyard that reminded me, in a small way, of my mother's cedar-smelling house in Sutter Creek. I made an offer, went through the title process, signed the deed, and went home with a copy of the recorded instrument in a folder in my purse. I put it in the hall closet, next to my mother's transfer-on-death instrument for the Sutter Creek property, which transferred to me cleanly and without complication on the schedule she had arranged, because she had filed the right paper in the right office at the right time, and because the paper was always the thing. Diane called me once after the separation was finalized. It was a Sunday morning, and I was in my new kitchen making coffee, and she called from the number I still had saved. I answered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to know that I never meant for things to go the way they did. I genuinely thought I was helping." I believed her. "I know," I said. She said, "I should have asked you." "Yes," I said. "You should have." There was a pause. "I hope you're doing well," she said. And then she said, "She seems like she was a wonderful woman. Your mother." My throat tightened. "She was," I said. "She taught me about paperwork." Diane made a small sound that might have been a laugh. We didn't speak again after that. I don't know if we ever will. I don't hold what she did in the sharp-edged way I might have expected to. What Diane did came from a genuine belief that she knew better, and that belief came from a lifetime of being the person in her family who solved problems, and I understand that even when I am clear-eyed about the harm it caused. What I will not do is pretend the harm wasn't real, or that it didn't cost me something, or that the resolution was anything other than a public correction administered by a title officer doing her job at a closing table on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The house was always mine. The paper said so. Raymond, I should say, said something to me in the parking lot after the closing, before I found Marcy Aldrin, in the brief shuffled exit phase when people were collecting their things, and the Hayeses were speaking quietly to Carol Tran, and Diane was talking to Daniel in a low voice by the elevator. Raymond walked past me toward the stairs, and then stopped. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who has something to say, and is not sure whether the saying of it is within his lane. Then he said, "That's your mother's house." He didn't say it as a question. He said it as a statement of something he understood and was acknowledging. "Yes," I said. "It is." He nodded once. He went down the stairs. That was the whole of it. But I have thought about that moment more than I might have expected to in the months since. Because Raymond understood in the parking lot what Diane was still processing at the closing table, that the house was mine, not because I had argued for it or fought for it or even raised my voice about it, but because my name had been on a document filed with the county recorder's office since the day I signed the purchase agreement, and that was simply a fact, and facts do not require defense. They just require someone to read them aloud. My mother believed in paperwork the way some people believe in luck, not as a substitute for judgment, but as the codification of it. A deed is not just a legal instrument. It is a record of intention. It says, someone at a specific moment in time decided that this was so. And the decision, once filed, does not require you to argue for it again. You just have to be in the room when someone reads it. I think about that a lot. I think about all the things that could have gone differently if I had not shown up at the closing. If I had stayed home and let Diane handle it. If I had not called Helen Kurtz from my mother's funeral home parking lot. If I had not paid attention, all those years ago, to a woman sitting at a kitchen table pointing to her name on a piece of paper. The house was never in danger, legally. But I needed to be in the room anyway. Not because the outcome required my presence to be real. It would have been real regardless. But because there is something that matters about being the one who sees it happen. About standing in the silence after Marcy Aldrin reads your name into it and knowing in your body, in the specific way your shoulders drop and your breath comes back, that the paper holds. My mother knew what she owned. She made sure I did too. That is the only inheritance I needed. Everything else was extra. That's my story. A for sale sign in a yard. A closing agent with a folder. And a deed that said exactly what it had always said. My mother kept every important document in a labeled folder in the hall closet. I do the same now. But I know that not everyone grows up with someone who sits down and shows them what ownership looks like on paper, how to read a deed, where to file an instrument, what a transfer on death clause actually does.
I want to ask you something.
Did someone in your life teach you about property, money, or legal documents, the practical, unsexy stuff that actually protects you? Or did you have to figure it out the hard way? And if you had to figure it out the hard way, what's the one thing you wish someone had told you earlier? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.